provided audiences an inside look at the democratic process. If you have a comment about our network, please write us at C-SPAN, 400 North Capitol Street, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. Our zip code is 20001.
Up next, we continue our look at today's events in the Middle East. Joining us now are two military experts who will discuss the administration's decision to commit ground and naval forces to the Persian Gulf region and to Saudi Arabia. We welcome Admiral Eugene Carroll, the Deputy Director of the Center for Defense Information, and Jonathan Gaffney. He's an Adjunct Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The pair will take your calls about U.S. policy objectives and will also relate their own personal experiences from having served in the region.
Admiral Eugene Carroll of the Center for Defense Information. Senator Robb earlier told us that we're getting into a long-term military commitment. You agree?
In all probability, I don't think this is going to resolve in a week or a month. The hopeful resolution will be through the pressure of the economic boycott, the sanctions on Iraq, and it will resolve without military violence. But that will mean maintaining a military presence and readiness for a sustained period of time.
Do we have the wherewithal to do that?
Oh, we've got more than the wherewithal to do that level of presence that we're establishing, yes.
Jonathan Gaffney, long-term commitment?
Yes, I think I agree, Admiral Carroll. There aren't simple solutions to this. It will take a while. No matter what route we take, whether it be economic warfare or actual fighting, it's going to be a while.
I know you both had an opportunity to listen to the briefings from the Pentagon carried on television and listen to official statements on what our objectives are. Based on the kind of equipment that has been moving out and the number of personnel, does that jibe with what we're hearing officials say?
Basically, yes. All we've proposed to do so far is to create the symbols of support for Saudi Arabia, the symbols of resistance to Saddam Hussein. There's no military capability moved or moving which gives us a real offensive capability against Iraq, so that we have established a defensive symbol and left the decision to Saddam Hussein as to whether he's going to challenge it. Logically, rationally, he should not. But we're not certain how rational he is.
I'd like your thoughts on this.
Well, of course, the troops that we put there, no question, that we didn't nearly put the force down that we would need to launch a counterattack or to invade Kuwait to clear the Iraqis out of there. Excuse me. However, some of the aircraft that are in the region, what is right there in the Saudi Peninsula is exactly what is what we have. We have B-52s and F-111s, of course, in Turkey. Aircraft that could be used, and probably could be used very quickly by the President if he showed decide to actually attack either targets inside Iraq or Iraqi formations or forces in Kuwait, whatever the President should decide he wants to do.
All that would do, however, is sort of raise the level of violence and ensure a prolonged Iraqi resistance. Our basic hope is to avoid the outbreak of violence and the resolution through political and economic action.
But, excuse me, I got to interrupt. If the Iraqis should position themselves in such a way, which they have already done to a certain degree, I haven't looked at intelligence photos, and unfortunately we can't do that, it seems to be from the intelligence reports that we do hear that they have masked themselves in such a way that would be highly threatening. Whether or not the President should wait until they actually cross the line is another story, and I don't think it would be prudent to do so. If he saw the evidence was strong enough, they have missiles in place and possibly chemical weapons, they've massed enough tanks and forces, he would have, in a way, and if you're going to wage a war, and we're almost making that commitment, you got a preemptive strike, and he has that option.
Good evening from Washington. Once again, we are going to focus on the strategic aspects of this, of the developments in the Middle East during our program for the next 45 minutes or so. Our two guests in our studios here in Washington are Rear Admiral Eugene Carroll. He's retired from the U.S. Navy and is now Deputy Director of the Center for Defense Information in Washington, D.C. He had 37 years of active military service, and since then, through his position at the Center for Defense Information, has been involved in a policy assessment role here in Washington. Jonathan Gaffney also does the same thing. It assesses policy. It's with the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University. It is a think tank, and Washington has certainly many people employed in the business of analyzing foreign policy and military developments, and that's what we're going to do with you for the next portion of our call-in program. We'll be going to the phones in just a couple of minutes. Our telephone lines are already very busy. If you do manage to get through to our lines here in Washington, please keep your questions brief, and since we have two guests, we'll try to get through as many calls as we can, as quickly as we can, with your cooperation on that end of the television set. Let me ask you a little bit about the chemical warfare aspect of this question, which has certainly been much on the minds of those making plans in the Pentagon. What do we know about their capability and our readiness against it?
We know that he has and has used chemical weapons, including nerve gas and mustard gas. We know that driven far enough and feeling threatened enough, he might resort to them again. I have no first-hand knowledge of the equipment which our troops took out there, but I would suspect that competition for space on the airplanes prevented them from carrying along the masks, the protective clothing, and the antidotes and so on that would be necessary for effective response to a chemical attack.
And those on the ground, in addition, if you read some of the reports, the analysis, if you add all of that gear on top of the desert heat, that poses an additional problem.
Yeah. Chemical warfare is a terrible burden not only on those attacked but on those attacking, because then they must be prepared for reprisal, and when you add to that the heat, you practically tie your troops down. They're unable to move. Chemical weapons are never decisive. They're terrible, inhumane, vicious weapons, but they never decide a campaign.
I'd like to get an understanding before we go to calls, and we have a caller already on hold. We are not alone in this, in at least the military aspect of this operation.
As well as the economic aspect as well. For the first time in my memory, and I'm sure a lot of other people's as well, the response from other nations has been very surprising and overwhelming in a way. I really give the President a lot of credit in that area. We've put ourselves as a country in a very good position politically. We have the support of not just the people we'd expect it from, but support within the Arab community to a certain degree. We have the support of the Soviet Union to a certain degree, which is more than we ever could have hoped for. We have the support of the Japanese, which is very surprising. They depend more on Arab oil than any other country in the world. Very encouraging. The Chinese.
Even China.
Even China, exactly, has been willing.
Yeah,
in terms of a military standpoint.
Yeah, very important point here. The last time we tried to use embargoes and diplomatic pressure was in Libya. And our actions in Libya were not approved by the world community, so they did not cooperate. That's right. They did not support us. Here, there is a strong community of interest in protecting access to Persian Gulf oil. That's right. And as a result, we have this support.
Let's go to Neptune, New Jersey for our first question. Caller, you're on the air.
Good evening. I have two questions. Perhaps first with Admiral Carroll. Saudi Arabia prohibits Jews from setting foot in its territory, Admiral, and I was wondering if Saudi Arabia suspended or remained silent on that rule, or if U.S. forces were culled of Jewish personnel before deployment. The second thing I'd wonder about is, since Saudi Arabia has been demonstrated to be a supporter of the PLO and terrorist organizations, if we exacted any promise from the Saudis that they would stop supporting terrorism in response for our defending their territory.
I've served in the Persian Gulf, and I know that you are correct when the Saudis do impose a religious screen. However, that's in normal, peacetime, quiet conditions. I'm reasonably confident that there will be no screen of individual members of the units that are going to Saudi Arabia. The second part of your question was?
With regard to eliciting a promise with regard to support for the PLO.
Oh, no. The understandings reached by Mr. Cheney and King Fahd are not known to us in detail, but I'm sure there was no codicil to the agreement that there would be some relationship in support of the PLO established.
Columbus, Georgia, you're on the air.
Yes, Admiral, as one Navy man to another, I'd like to know, honestly, what are the nuclear capabilities of this Hussein, because of in several newspapers and also in the press recently, I've heard that this man was seeking nuclear weapons.
Well, he certainly set out to create nuclear capability. As you know, the Israelis took out part of his establishment some years ago, and I doubt that they have created any nuclear devices that could serve as weapons. I would not fear an Iraqi nuclear response.
There is to be a meeting of the Arab states tomorrow. How effective can such a meeting be?
I think, personally, I think it's kind of a last-ditch face-saving effort on the part of the moderate Arabs to try one last time to reach out to Saddam Hussein, give him one last opportunity to mend his ways, so to speak. I think that some of the moderate Arab states are more than willing to go along with U.S. efforts. I think they need one last chance because, again, they run risks in their own country of siding with the Americans. I don't think there was one Arab who was interviewed on TV for the past 3 days who wasn't in support of Saddam Hussein and what he did to Kuwait. Very dangerous line to walk.
When you say they run risks in their own country, specifically what kinds of risks?
Well, I think the anti-American sentiment throughout the Middle East is pretty strong. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the rich Arab oil states have always been somewhat of a pariah in their own Arab community. They have very wealthy states. Some people say they haven't helped out their poorer neighbors as much as they should have. So here you have a guy like Saddam Hussein, grew up in a very poor background, who's standing up to the imperialist Americans. We've seen this before in the Middle East. Very popular.
Let me ask you specifically on that note, King Hussein of Jordan has not supported the United States thus far. What will that mean for him on Capitol Hill, you think, in the future?
It's not going to help him. When there's any consideration of a military aid package or arms sales, he's going to have sacrificed some of his potential support with his position.
He's tempered his position somewhat, very little, but it's not nearly enough to help him out in the long haul.
This is an example of the haves and the have-nots in the Muslim community. We are interested in doing business with the conservative haves, and we've got to expect criticism from the have-nots who see themselves being left out while all of this wealth goes to the oil producers.
Next question comes from Spokane, Washington. You're on the air.
Yes, Admiral Carroll.
Yes.
I've always enjoyed listening to your observations and agree with you most of the time.
Uh-oh.
But, the Middle East has been a volatile area for many, many, many years. Why have we not taken the studied strategy and all of this that you two men are talking about, and everyone in Washington and around the country, plotting a reasonable course of action should something like this occur? I mean, there was a Stark incident, the flagging of the Kuwaiti tankers. I mean, it's ridiculous. Here we are running up and down the Persian Gulf with our big ships and everything, and we're totally dependent on the whims and caprices of an Arab whose culture is totally alien to our own. And why don't we develop our own resources? Why don't we do it?
Thank you.
Well, the first thing about our position when Iran was the enemy was we were determined Iran would not defeat Iraq. So we actually helped Iraq. We gave them food, we gave them credits, we contributed to their strength and well-being. Then the war was settled, and all of a sudden the person we had befriended and supported started becoming aggressive and taking action against our interests, and now here he is confronting us militarily. We have to adopt a new posture and consider a new enemy. I wish that it was possible to make a coherent, long-term strategy for the Middle East, but the animosities and the relationships out there change faster than we can change.
With regard to long-term planning, as that caller suggested, we have heard some on Capitol Hill decrying the lack of a long-term energy policy.
Absolutely, yes.
Is that a popular sentiment, the criticism of the country for not having that? And will these events put some impetus on developing one.
I hope so. Just like the last oil shock in the 70s, oil shock in the early 70s, excuse me, all created, Jimmy Carter developed his Department of Energy to deal with our long-range energy policy. Of course, you came to the 80s, I'm not going to blame it on the Republican administration, essentially gutted any long-range energy policy that we had in favor of a strong economy. Cheap, very cheap oil. You know, oil is the #1 inflationary factor in the world. The price of energy goes up, inflation begins, and that's one of the big problems. We scrapped that in the 80s, and in a way, we're paying the price for that today.
Admiral Carroll?
One of the long-term policies we ought to have is try to create a more stable situation in the Middle East so that that source of supply is available at reasonable prices without going to war. To do that, I think we have to be proactive in trying to convince the have nations to share more of this wealth in useful forms with the entire region. We can't have fabulously wealthy sultans and emirs and hopelessly poverty-stricken nations and expect any stability out there.
Westville, New Jersey.
Hi, I'm calling. We're talking about our troops going over. We want to know when other troops, or like Russian troops in other countries, are also going to be going over, because we haven't heard anything about them going.
Thanks a lot. Jonathan Gaffney.
Sure. Today, of course, the reports are coming in slowly. I understand that the British have expressed a willingness to commit forces if the Saudis should request them. Again, Egypt is kind of, yesterday they were, and today they're waiting for tomorrow. So far as the Soviets go, I've been saying this all day, unfortunately, but I don't think that one of the best favors the Soviets can do for us right now is stick to their arms embargo, which they've agreed to impose. The longer they stick with that, the less spare parts the Iraqis can get would help, unfortunately, if we should happen to go to war with them.
The French in the military half of this equation, where are they?
They are not committed except in naval terms. They have agreed to send some ships out to participate in a naval blockade if necessary, but there's no intention, I believe, at all of a French troop commitment in the region.
I ask that because as you look down some of the lists and the like about Western countries which have sold arms, France is on that list.
Very much so. With respect to Iraq, they were the second principal supplier of arms.
So if this thing escalated, they could find themselves in a situation where they were in a combat situation against their own equipment.
Oh, very definitely, but they don't appear to want to take that step. They have, however, been much more cooperative on the economic side than I had expected them to be. They've been very supportive of the embargo on Iraq.
Why did you not expect them to be?
Well, they've made a lot of money off of Iraq. They've got a lot of equipment there. They can go right on selling parts and maintaining this tight tie they have with Iraq for the future.
As our country looks at Europe in a strategic way for the future, what does the French accession in this case say about their future intentions?
Nothing. It says that in this circumstance they see the need to cooperate with the community of nations to ensure access to the Persian Gulf oil supply on favorable terms. The next time around they may have a different view.
Los Angeles, you're on the air.
Hi. I have a question for Mr. Jonathan. United States is sending all its troops to Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi Arabia from a possible attack from Iraq. Will in the future, just in case for any reason, if Israelis intend to attack Saudi Arabia, will the United States will be there to defend Saudi Arabia from Israeli attack?
Obviously that's a very good question. That's one of the problems is the United States has in the Middle East and a lot of Western countries. Obviously, we're very close allies of Israel. We're also very close allies of Saudi Arabia. We depend very much on Middle Eastern oil. That puts the United States in a very difficult position. And to answer your question, which is extremely speculative, I don't know. I don't think anybody does.
The hypothesis, I think, is unrealistic. Israel has enough problems of its own without making an active enemy out of Saudi Arabia. I think the prospects of an Israeli attack on Saudi Arabia are negligible.
With regard to this specific situation that we're seeing right now in the Middle East, what's the advice that you would give Israel?
Keep quiet. Keep out of it. Stay as low and as unobtrusive as they possibly can.
I think they've done just as, in their own way, diplomatically, I think they've probably done just as good a job as the United States has. The only thing they've done, they drew their own line at the Jordan border, and if Iraqi were to move into Jordan, they drew their line, but they drew it very early. They didn't make a big deal out of it, and they've kind of left it at that.
West Palm Beach, Florida.
Yes, I have a question for Admiral Carroll.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, there was a guest on earlier the Honorable Charles Robb, and there was a woman that called in with a question for him. I think she was speaking with the wrong person at the time, but the question was, how do blacks feel about being assigned for duty over in the Middle East? And she also asked, is there any kind of a network that they have, you know, that they show their dissension or whatever. I was stationed over in Diego Garcia, and I've been in the Navy for over 10 years, and I've witnessed just such an active black network. How do they deal with something like that?
Well, I've commanded ships, I've commanded squadrons, I've dealt with all races, and I have yet to see a black community within a military unit. I'm fortunate in that respect, perhaps, but that's been my experience. I see no indication whatever that there is any, quote, black attitude, unquote, concerning military service, concerning combat service, or concerning carrying out orders of the Commander-in-Chief.
You also spent several years in the military.
Yes, I did. Yes,
including a tour
myself.
on the Nimitz.
That's correct. Yeah.
Your reaction? It's the second time this question has come up during.
Oh, really? I'm not surprised. The question somewhat surprised me because the people that I've always dealt with, particularly on a ship, very close quarters, where tensions would rise, if they would arise, I saw very little problem between that.
Let's go next to Los Angeles. Caller, you're on the air.
Yes, please. I do have two questions. The first one is we heard at the news that United States said that Egyptian people sent troops to Saudi Arabia. Today, the Egyptian president denies this thing.
All right, your second question?
And second question, now that Iraq announced that Kuwait is a part of Iraq, what's going to happen?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One for each of you. Why don't we start, Admiral Carroll, with you on the first one?
On the Egyptian troops?
Yes.
There does seem to be some cross signals someplace. Whoever released the information that Egypt was committed to sending troops to Saudi Arabia either had bad information, or the Egyptians subsequently changed their mind, or the Sauds declined to have them. It's entirely possible that the Sauds might not feel comfortable with certain forces in their country, and they have the right to decline. Which of those cases is the truth? I don't know.
What's
I would
next?
speculate that it was premature and not erroneous. I think they just someone jumped the gun. I think the Egyptians are committed. I think Mubarak is very committed. Just a matter that someone announced it about 2 days too early.
He managed to remain very ambiguous in his press conference this morning.
He did.
I'll turn to you then for the what's next for Kuwait.
Well, that's the thing. It's kind of like there's a little bit. Reminds a little bit of a boxing match between rounds. What happened today was the Iraqis came out swinging again by annexing Kuwait first thing this morning. If you're waiting for a breathing period for tensions to draw down, Saddam Hussein made a very clear effort not to do that by annexing Kuwait sometime this morning. Doesn't really help at all.
Should the West's long-term objective be for sovereignty for Kuwait?
Yes, a restoration of sovereignty, of course, but I don't believe we can do it by direct military means. If we think in terms of a campaign through Kuwait, there won't be anything left to restore sovereignty. It'll just be a waste area.
But that's assuming that that's the only way you can do that. So the quickest way you could possibly do is to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
Oh yes, and bypass Kuwait. We'll have to leave it aside and get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then we can deal with the political question and sovereignty in Kuwait.
As we all have heard, I mean, it's a great question is actually how stable he really is in his own government. He seems to be hated and despised by all, so what you hear, you get rid of him, and Lord knows what could happen after that.
Fort Bragg, North Carolina, you're on the air.
Sir, I am a sergeant here at Fort Bragg. I am on alert to go. My question to you is, sir, what do you think the chances are that the Iraqis will attack Saudi Arabia? And if they do, will the Navy and Air Force be used first prior to us going in?
Logically, rationally, Saddam Hussein should realize he's miscalculated, and he should be busily engaged in rethinking and restructuring his position and entering into political negotiations quietly and privately that will save his face and get him out of this mess. But I'm not sure how rational he is. I don't think anybody can predict with confidence that he's going to do this logical step.
His track record over the past 3 weeks has been abysmal in terms of trying to predict what he's promised he would do and what he's actually done. if in fact we should get into a combat situation with him, and I hope that we don't, but I personally feel that we will shortly. Obviously, our biggest assets are air power. We have some assets there. We have assets on aircraft carriers, which in and of themselves, just remember this, aren't useful where they are. They're only useful if you can get them to refuel somewhere, either on the Saudi Peninsula.
Give them fighter cover, so on.
And do it that way.
Specific answer to the caller is that we would attempt to blunt the Iraqi attack. We would attempt to impede it, attack the lines of communication, prevent them from resupplying and reinforcing, and I suspect they would bog down fairly early in northeast Saudi Arabia, in the oil areas, unfortunately, but far short of Riyadh, the capital. Then we would be bringing in more ground troops and getting ready to roll them back on the ground. And it would be heavily air power that would blunt the attack.
And that's the big concern that I have, and I think a lot of people have. Yes, you can attack them from the air, and the United States can attack them probably very effectively. The Iraqi Air Force isn't known for, they don't have a long history, so to speak. The United States naval aviators and Air Force aviators who are there could probably do quite a good job. My concern is trying to push anything back, because you're not going to push them back just with air cover. You have to push them back with ground forces, and I don't think that we're committed to doing that. I don't think we have the assets that could actually do a useful job over there. It'd take a month and a half just to get them there.
No, a month and a half is time if we can hold them where they are.
New Britain, Connecticut, you're on the air.
I'd like to know two things. Who supplies these countries with arms, and why do they supply them with the arms? Why don't they cut back on them? Then there wouldn't be all this trouble.
Well, the United States, I could run a whole list of countries that supply. Use the example of Iraq, who has sold Iraq arms. They do it for many reasons, to keep up, to maintain stable defense industries back in their own home countries, for one thing. A lot of these Middle Eastern countries have the money to burn. Another one is to project influence. You know, for a long time, the Middle East was divided into certain spheres of influence. Look at the Iraqi military. The majority of their ground forces and the ground equipment were sold to them by the Soviet Union. It's a way of kind of buying influence. We sold Iran everything they possibly needed back during the 70s. It was our way of buying them influence. Same thing with Saudi Arabia.
I agree with the premise of the caller that infusing the region with arms is like pouring gasoline on a burning bonfire, and the United States has been just as bad as the Soviet Union and France and all the major suppliers.
But it's buying influence, and if the United States, the United States does not do it, then of course our biggest concern is that somebody else will. So you might as well sell them on your own terms, try to maintain some type of control, over their government when you sell them. It doesn't always work out that way.
We have to find something to disagree on in one program. Selling arms is purported to be a way of influencing policy and controlling events. It has been a lousy way to do it. You end up looking down the barrels of the guns and missiles you sold them 5 years ago.
San Francisco.
Yes, I'd like to state that I think the U.S. government is very quick and eager to deploy the military in countries whose citizens are people of color. I also think that why haven't they applied the same policies, both military and economic, to Israel for their occupation, annexing, and murdering of the Palestinian people?
We're doing it. It's clear. There's one reason we're doing it is because, unfortunately, the Western world depends so much on Middle Eastern oil that to disrupt that flow, or to use the example that everyone's been saying for 24 hours now, to have one relatively unstable individual in charge of up to 50% of the world's oil reserves is absolutely intolerable, and that's really where we stand today.
I don't believe that Semitic people are people of color in that sense either. I mean, if the caller's premise is you have to be black or yellow or red to be invaded by the United States, that's not true at all. We invaded Grenada, not a black nation. We certainly clobbered Panama, which is lily white as far as the government is concerned. So the premise that we pick on colored races, I think, is invalid.
Crestwood, Illinois, you are on the air.
Yes, my question for the Admiral is, since the intelligence community has known what type of an individual Mr. Hussein is, isn't there some kind of a shortcoming with our intelligence that at least 2 weeks ago we knew that he was making moves down there in the Middle East? And why is it taking so long to get any type of deployment of our troops? It took almost 3 days to get any type of naval intervention in there to show a presence there.
Sir, may I ask you, you mentioned a military response. Do you not support an economic response?
Yes, I do, but knowing the type of individual Mr. Hussein is, with using chemical weapons a year and a half ago, even against his own people that opposed him, gives an indication of his mentality.
All right, thanks.
And what would we have done if he had continued on into Saudi Arabia? What kind of a position would we be in now?
Thank you.
I agree with the caller's question about the quality of our intelligence. The United States has too much intelligence, too many intelligence services. DIA, CIA, every armed service has its own intelligence service. The State Department, and on and on and on. What we need is not more intelligence, but better managed intelligence from fewer experts. The deployment of our forces is simply a proof of the fact we don't have rapid deployable forces. We've built our armed forces for strategic war with the Soviet Union and for war on the battlefields of Europe. And that doesn't leave you with the kind of mobility and quick response capability that we're lacking in Saudi Arabia.
We have a caller in the line, but I do want to ask about one element of this equation we haven't discussed, and that is U.S. citizens that are being held against their will, citizens of other countries also being detained. The U.S. government is not calling them hostages. How do they play into this picture?
They play a tremendous role in this picture. As any hostage, you know, the 70s and the 80s were the decades of the hostages, so to speak. Unfortunately, I think hostage is a dirty word with the administration, and it should be. It's a very difficult situation when you have upwards of 4,000 Americans spread throughout those countries in the Middle East. Very dangerous.
We spoke about this before we came in here. We shiver every time the president goes on television and says,
That's right.
I won't stand for the mistreatment of American hostages or American citizens. I sympathize with him and I feel the same way, but going public and saying, I won't tolerate something I can't do anything about
very difficult.
is not wise.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein doesn't need to be incited or stimulated to take action against Americans, and when the president says he can't do it, he's very apt to show that he damn well can.
Columbia, South Carolina.
Admiral Carroll, I'm an old combat crew member from the Missile Man system in North Dakota, and I was wondering if Hussein plays the poison gas option, how long, if he does it well, can we avoid involving battlefield nuclear weapons, given our current ground forces on the ground there? This is a distinct problem that many of our listeners don't know about.
That's right.
If he does that, how long can we really hold that off?
Can I ask you, what is the definition of a battlefield nuclear weapon?
One that's delivered by short-range tactical forces, artillery shells, short-range missiles, aircraft in the battle area, as opposed to the long-range systems, which we call strategic weapons.
Are they in their effect? Are they any smaller or more targeted?
You will never know whether you've been killed by a battlefield weapon or a strategic weapon. It's just one blinding flash and it's all over. The question is a good one. It, I think, assumes a greater chemical warfare capability than Iraq has. I think if they shoot their bolt with the chemical weapons they have, they still won't decide the battle. But they certainly will stimulate a tremendous reaction, emotional and otherwise, to go after him with everything we have.
Absolutely.
I don't believe, however, that the decision will be made to use nuclear weapons in this situation under any circumstances. They are simply useless militarily. They are too destructive. You can't contain the effects or limit them to battlefields or military forces. You kill civilians indiscriminately. And we're going to find that we're unable to use the weapons we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on for very valid military and political reasons.
No, again, I think it's an excellent point to bring up, because what we're dealing with is the weapons of mass destruction, whether it be chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. Just use a scenario that's very distasteful to talk about. The Iraqis used chemical weapons and thousands of Americans on the Saudi desert die. Well, that's going to charge a response within the United States that the president would have a very difficult time not using weapons of mass destruction in return, whether it be chemical weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. They're at his option, and I wouldn't be surprised if he did, given the right kind of circumstances. It's a good option. It's things that we haven't really thought about.
Let me offer one last thought on this, just as an illustration. In the 1950s, I had a wartime target that I would attack with a small battlefield weapon, to use the terminology of the caller, from a small warplane. It was a kind of a second-rate target. It was the only thing that was available within range of my carrier. And yet to destroy that target would have taken out 600,000 human beings. You can't fight that way. You cannot justify imposing military power on another nation in that destructive fashion.
Tacoma, Washington, thanks for waiting. You're on the air.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a couple of questions. First, regarding the potential for Mr. Hussein simply disregarding either the pipeline through Turkey or the northeast Saudi oil fields, what is the potential for him deciding to avail himself of the Israeli ports by simply rolling through Jordan and engaging Israel? Israel is not really high on the popularity list of the rest of the people in the country, in the Mideast area, and we're looking at 1 million-plus troops with guns in their hands today. Can Israel defend themselves? Will the other countries in the area involve themselves in that defense?
If Saddam Hussein wants some problems, let him attack Israel, because my opinion is that Iraqis wouldn't stand a lot of chance against the Israelis. The Israelis have not just great weapons, but they have a willingness to use them. They have in the past. Hussein would be asking for a lot of problems if he even thought of attacking Israel.
Let me add that his greatest limitation is logistic support. The second he starts moving out of Iraq, he starts running out of the ability to supply and reinforce his troops. And the last point we haven't mentioned tonight, he's still got Iran on the other side.
That's right.
If he threw all of his energies into a futile effort to get to Israel, he'd have Iran down his back.
And Iran issued, and just to kind of complete the balance, and Iran issued a statement, very surprising again today, which was condemning, I think they used the word condemn, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and they didn't say they wouldn't stand for it, but they used very strong language, which would obviously automatically make Hussein worry about one other thing.
Stay with that for just a second. Sure. We have been seeing just a little bit of opening by Iran towards the west, specifically.
Surprising, very surprising. The theory is, and this is all evolving very quickly, the theory was yesterday that Iran would do anything to rub America's nose in the dirt. In this instance, they've come quite moderate. It has been somewhat surprising.
Bristol, Pennsylvania.
Yes, everyone's talking about how long we can do without oil and how long the Iraqis can do without the oil money. What I'm concerned about is how much food do the Iraqis have? Obviously, they can't grow wheat in the desert, and we supply them with grain. First of all, would like to know how much of their food do we supply, or does the Western nation supply, and how long could they last without that supply of food?
Thank you.
Well, I can't give you exact figures, but the United States is one major supplier of food to Iraq, as is Europe.
Australia.
I think, yes, I think that, strangely enough, we're the major supplier of rice to Iraq.
Yes, that's correct.
That's one particular product I know about. So they really are going to be in difficult straits very early on in a stringent economic embargo. I don't see any way he can maintain the strength of his nation and the viability of that nation at the end of 3 to 6 months of an effective embargo.
And one of the concerns, again, just go back to the intel question, or what is an intel failure. Again, I think we've all read different figures about how much food he actually has. Some people say he's got enough to feed his people for 6 months, and some people say people would be hungry by next week. Very difficult to estimate.
Mount Clemens, Michigan. Caller, you're on the air.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'm a former U.S. Army pilot, UH-60 Blackhawks, and I was in Panama, Honduras, and quite a few other places. And what I'm concerned about is the interest that you have insofar as chemical weapons. We do not train for that. Even though it is in our capacity to train, we do not train for that. Also, we fly quite a few missions under goggles at night, and goggles is a very controversial thing right now. What do you have insofar as that information for us as far as pilots go?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Again, I'm sorry. Is the question, if in fact you're correct that we don't train adequately for chemical warfare with Army aviators, then I would say that we have some troubles if they use chemical weapons.
I don't think we train adequately across the entire United States Armed Services for chemical warfare.
Queens, New York.
Hi, my name is Regina. At any rate, I was just wondering that since the Iran-Contra deal, if our two gentlemen think that Iran is some kind of ally for us because we were supplying arms to them and so on. And I was just saying as a sidebar that it's kind of funny that the Congress is considering cutting the B-2 and how all of this should happen, which would make everybody pretty, you know, iffy about whether or not to cut it and whether or not it's a good idea to pull back on defense at all.
All right, thanks. Admiral, why don't you suggest, I know you've been following the debate on Capitol Hill with regard to the defense spending. This whole situation is coming at something of an interesting time.
Yes.
In that. Will it have an effect?
We've spent about $3 trillion on military programs in the last 11 years. The buildup actually started under Jimmy Carter, which is a fact that most people have lost sight of. $3 trillion, and here we are with armed services that really have very grave limitations in their ability to get to Saudi Arabia and to act there. How much more money is justified for that capability? I don't think any more is, but I know this, the money we're wasting in preparing for nuclear war and war in Europe with these massive new weapon systems is not justified. And I believe there's still a lot of money that can be saved in military spending by cutting out preparing for the wars we're not going to fight, and then creating a legitimate defense capability for the possible engagements such as this one.
We have just 2 minutes. Columbus, Ohio, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd just like to make a correction to the Admiral. Earlier today during the Pentagon meeting, they made the statement that the troops had prepared for gas-type wars, chemical wars, with adequate equipment and training in the Mojave Desert and those places. And I'm making this statement just on the basis so the families don't worry of the troops going over.
Well, that's good information. I didn't hear that in the press conference. It's been my experience over the years, 37 that I spent in the military, that we did very little serious training in chemical warfare, either offensive or defensive, and I don't believe that pattern has changed greatly in recent years.
We have 1 minute. I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Gaffney. We were talking about some of the alliances, at least temporarily, being forged. One sidebar to this is that the United States may find itself an ally of the Soviet Union with regard to the situation.
Yes. Think what would have happened. I was saying today, think of what would have happened 5 years ago. If, and one of the lines that we always drew strategically with the Soviet Union is Middle East oil supplies. The fact that we're getting their cooperation in two ways. One way, they've agreed to an embargo of arms, which could be extremely important if we should get in any prolonged conflict. And also, we're waiting to hear back if they're going to tell us what they actually gave them, which would be immensely useful in assessing what we're going to do militarily to know what the Iraqis have received from the Soviets. Interesting twist of events.
Admiral, the last word, what to watch in this story? What do you watch?
What I'm watching?
No,
I'm watching.
The callers at home as they're following us, what are signs to watch?
Signs to watch are the actions of Saddam Hussein. He has the decision now. He can either break the stalemate that I think has been created for the moment, or he can be rational and start working his way out of this mess through diplomatic initiatives.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Thanks. Admiral Eugene Carroll of the Center for Defense Information and Jonathan Gaffney of the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for answering our viewers' questions on some of the strategic issues surrounding the Middle East. Thanks for watching.
Join us this Saturday night beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern Time for the remarks of Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady. Earlier today, he addressed members and guests gathered at the National Press Club, and we will bring you his comments again that Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 Pacific Time. Up next, we break for a look at the overnight program schedule, then bring you a recap of the day's events in the Middle East, beginning with this morning's address to the nation by President Bush. Good evening from the nation's